and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics driving Texas. I'm your co-host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and with me is my co-host, Derek Cohen, who's our Vice President of Policy. How's it going, Derek?
I can't complain. It's a little chilly out there.
Yeah, a little cold. Everybody's dealing with the weather. Hopefully everybody stayed safe on the roads. It looks like things are going to clear up through the weekend, so that's good to hear. So let's get into what we're going to be talking about today. First and foremost, we do love your feedback. We get a lot of good constructive criticism. Others just kind of silly and kind of sometimes hateful, but that's okay.
You're talking about what I send you.
Yeah, that's just the stuff that I get from Derek. But we do want to know what you want to talk about. We want to know what our listeners are interested in. If you have any ideas for the show, ideas for topics, or ideas even for guests, we'd love to hear about it from you. You can find me on Twitter at RealBphil, and you can find Derek at Cohen at TPPF, Cohen at TPPF. So, all right, on today's show, we're going to go in depth on an issue that is fairly controversial, fairly provocative, which is this new legislation, new proposal in the state capital, or in the capital in Texas, banning minors from using social media. Obviously, a very controversial topic. We'll get into the ins and outs of that issue later in the show. For top topics, we are going to talk about the electrical grid. We're going to talk about what happened this week, whether that was good or bad. There obviously were some issues, some localized issues, as they call it, but we'll talk about that because the grid is very much an important issue to Texans. And then it feels like we're talking about it every single week, but the school choice, parental empowerment fight is really starting to heat up. The governor started a statewide tour of 10 or 12 cities that he's going to be going to promote the issue of parent empowerment. And so, and the folks who oppose these issues are starting to get more active. So we'll talk about that fight going forward. And before that, we are super excited to announce that this show is going to be the first one where we have a guest on our show. Our very, very first guest on the Right Idea is going to be former Congresswoman Myra Flores is with us here today. So we're super excited to hear from her. And we're just going to talk about all the issues. We're going to talk about everything going on in Texas and around the country and just let her go. She's absolutely fantastic. Can't wait to hear from her. But first, of course, the reason you're all here is to hear from Derek and his Lege-Land update. Derek, what's going on up at the Capitol?
Well, to be honest with you, not a whole lot. You mentioned the weather we had this week, and that really closed down a lot of what was scheduled to happen. We had the Senate Finance Committee did kick off on Monday. And then just with, out of an abundance of caution, which turned out to be validated, canceled the rest of the week up until today, where we're going to hear the rest of the Article 1, the general government section of the budget. Article 2, which is healthcare, which, as you can imagine, is a fairly large part of our budget, has been kicked to the 21st. Okay. So starting next week, though, I think we're still on schedule for Article 3.
So what are the big issues then that you think that they're going to be talking about today at the committee hearing?
It could be, it's going to be all over the place. I know the Office of the Governor, so any sort of administrative work that Governor Abbott's doing and anything that's coming out of the office will be discussed. And the Office of the Governor is actually a pretty large office, even when it comes to handling both state revenue and federal pass-through revenue. Just for example, the office is Criminal Justice Division, deals a lot with, say, monies given from the federal government to support policing through the Burn grant program or whatever the case might be. And so they do actually have a lot in funding some of the policy decisions that are made. And so I think you're going to see a lot of discussion on there. And obviously you're going to probably, much like you're going to in several of the other articles, notably 4 and 5, you're going to be hearing about border enforcement, things like that as well.
We're going to have the governor's state of the state is going to be coming up soon. Presumably we'll be hearing about what he thinks his emergency items are. Are you hearing anything at the Capitol or any rumors or conjecture or speculation about emergency items and what we might be getting to deal with immediately between now and in the next 45 days or so?
Absolutely, I've heard a whole lot, but none I'd want to put my name on publicly. But just things all over the place.
And tax still a big one, obviously.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that just because something is declared or not declared an emergency item does not necessarily mean that earnest discussions can't start happening. Now, obviously, there's constitutional prohibitions on what can happen in terms of legislation absent an emergency proclamation. But that being said, the ball can all obviously start rolling. We're already talking about issues that important to the budget starting this week. So I do think that it's not a huge time impediment. or it's not going to be a huge coming out of the gate strong time-wise issue if he were to declare X, Y, or Z an emergency item. But what it does do is it basically puts a stamp of approval, like this is important to the leadership of the state.
Any issues, flying under the radar right now that you think are going to pop during the legislature? I'm thinking of, there's always talk about property tax and education, obviously the budget and those kinds of things. But healthcare, like you said, it's like half our budget, and yet you don't really see the media covering much about it. You don't really see a lot of bills necessarily being promoted or not. But you've got healthcare, criminal justice. There's a lot of the even energy. Some of those issues. Like ESG is a huge issue here in Texas. We addressed some of that last session. Will be addressed again. Was there anything flying under the radar that you think is ultimately gonna be more talked about in the coming months?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say flown under the radar, especially when you're as steeped with it as we are. It's like, because I guess we're under the radar just as a place of being. But I do think you hit something on healthcare, because usually about this time of year we'll start hearing rumors like, okay, well, here comes the nth time we're going to try to expand Medicaid. And as you and I well know, expanding Medicaid doesn't necessarily mean better delivery of care or medical services. But we're not seeing that really this session. So I think, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist or that a bill hasn't been filed, because that has happened. But what we're seeing is the earnest discussions on the people that are in that population. What are we doing to better serve them? Instead of, getting rid of Medicaid, which obviously isn't an option, or expanding Medicaid, which isn't politically viable, they're saying these population on Medicaid, we're acknowledging that they are a needy population. They have a different need set than, the general population sometimes. What are we doing to make sure that they are fully served by the system that we have? And, Speaker Phelan deserves to be praised for his leadership on this. Starting last session, his Healthy Texas, Healthy Families initiative was very successful. A lot of collaboration, not only with, David Ballat from our team, but folks from across the aisle. This wasn't a partisan push. But you saw the speaker's team really designate, this is what we want to lead on, and some really good ideas came out of that. And I don't want to put words in Speaker Phelan's mouth, but I think that with the orientation I've seen so far, I think we're going to see another successful reiteration of that.
It's very encouraging that conservatives are taking the issue of healthcare seriously. It's a top issue. We always see it. People are very concerned about, obviously, the affordability, but also access to care. And conservatives have kind of ceded that to the left over the last few decades. So I think Texas is really showing, as you mentioned last session, really showing that conservatives can be a real leader on the healthcare issue. One of the things that I would bring up that I'm pretty excited about, which I haven't seen any coverage of, but we've heard that there's a lot of energy behind it. Frankly, there's bipartisan energy behind government transparency and starting to change some of the rules, particularly at the local level, for the type and kind of data that the public can get access to, and not just the kind of materials, but the way in which they access it. So, making more data public. So, for example, if the city of Austin spends $100 million on something, there needs to be an accounting for where that money went, how it was delivered and all of that, but also getting those reports in a way that's searchable and sortable so that people can actually go in and understand where the money went, and essentially, increase the level of accountability and transparency into a government. Not the sexiest issue, but of course, when you ask
speak for yourself. I find it quite sexy.
But when you ask people about it, they're very concerned about government transparency, and frankly, it's linked directly to whether or not people trust that the government is acting on their behalf, whether or not people trust that the government is acting in their interest. And so I'm excited to see I think there's going to be a package of legislation on government transparency. And so I'm kind of in a nerdy way, kind of excited about that.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think more sunlight is never a bad thing. And if you generally look, there are, an almost near infinite number of ways that local governments or governments in general at whatever level can get around and obfuscate, matters of transparency. We're not talking necessarily about, stuff that needs to, be stored in a skiff or next to a Corvette or anything like that. But we do have this issue where, if you ask, City A, what was your budget on taxpayer-funded lobbying? Like, well, that depends. We can look up the records, but we can run these records off for you at 25 cents a copy. And it's about 800,000 pages. And so, you just cut us a check for that and we'll get you that information, which in and of itself is vexatious and onerous.
There's also a lot of stalling tactics where they don't get back to you if they don't think they have the answer, and they never respond to you. So some things we can change about that.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's your Lege-Land update. We're very, very excited, of course, that this is our first episode that we're going to have our very, very first guest. And through the magic of TV, we're going to pause very, very quickly. And when we come back after this message, we will have Congresswoman Mayra Flores with us, and we'll get her opinions on all things Texas and issues around the country. We'll be right back.
Texas is the most consequential state. And when Texas leads, America wins. But it isn't good enough to be pretty good. Texas has to be the best. And that starts with Texas policy.
The bottom line is that Texas is freer, it's safer, and it's more prosperous because of policies that have been designed, advocated, and implemented by TPPF.
TPPF is the foundry that forges the ideas and public policy shaping the future of Texas, the nation, and indeed the world. And we know that when we succeed in turning these ideas into public policy, that Texas will be saved for another generation. And we know that when we save Texas, we save America. New name, same spirit. We'll see you in 2023 at the Texas Policy Summit.
All right, and welcome back to The Right Idea at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I am super excited to announce that we have our first guest, our very first in-studio guest, is the wonderful former Congresswoman Mayra Flores. Thank you for joining the show.
I'm happy to be here.
All right.
Yes,
I want to get right into it. I just want to jump into it because, I love your take on things. I obviously follow all your social media and your Twitter, and you get thousands and thousands of likes within several minutes of tweeting out. So I see it all the time. Let's just go right into it with the border crisis. You live in McAllen. You're right there, right there at the border. You live in a border community. Before we get into all the problems with the current president and all of that, can you just kind of take us through, what it's like living in that community and just give us kind of a behind the scenes of, when you're going around into the grocery stores and getting from place to place and all of that, how much do you see the crisis spilling over the border?
Well, I live in McAllen, a beautiful city, honestly, and overall, I feel safe. And the reason I feel safe is because of our amazing law enforcement, of our amazing Border Patrol agents that do a tremendous job to make us feel safe in South Texas. So a lot of people in South Texas are not really seeing what's actually really happening because of the amazing work that our Border Patrol agents are doing. But it's really taking a toll on them and on the family. We've lost too many friends in the past few months. I've been in 3 funerals already. So this is very hard on my husband, who's a Border Patrol agent, who's been a Border Patrol agent for 14, 15 years now. And it's heavy on me and on our family. I've never been worried about his life. I took his safety for granted. I really did. And not a day goes by that I pray for his safety, that I pray for my family as well that is in Border Patrol. I have uncles and cousins as well serving our country. So it's very difficult. And I know that it's not just difficult on me, it's very difficult on all Border Patrol families right now. And I ask the Biden administration to secure our borders. This isn't political. This shouldn't be about Democrat or Republican. This is the right thing to do, not only for our Border Patrol agents, but for the American people and also for our immigrants. We shouldn't have immigrants coming into the United States illegally where they have to go through so much trauma, where they have to go through rape, abuse, and face death. Many of them have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to criminal organizations. Let's focus on legal immigration. If we care about immigrants, let's improve the legal process so we can encourage people to come here to the United States, to come here and accomplish the American dream, just like I did.
What are you hearing from local leaders? I mean, a lot of times we don't get to hear from the folks, who are responsible for, like you said, the safety and security of folks down there in those communities until they're on Fox News or until they say something that the media finally covers. But I imagine that there's a lot more communication that's done on a local basis, on a regular basis. How are local leaders responding to the issues and the challenges that you're facing there at the border?
Well, we have an amazing mayor, Villalobos in McAllen. He's done a tremendous job in McAllen, but that's not the case in every city in South Texas. Bronzeville is not that blessed. And we have a serious problem in Bronzeville right now. You see immigrants being released all over the city. And it's heartbreaking to see because you're seeing children, you're seeing women that are just being released in the city. They have nowhere to go, asking for money, asking for food to help them with transportation. And it's something that shouldn't be happening. And we're setting them up for failure because how are they going to provide for themselves and their children in a country that they don't know? This is why it's so important for us to secure the borders, and it's very different. Bronzeville and McAllen, very different.
Really,
but it really has to do because of the leadership at the local level.
And I want to kind of piggyback on that with, one of the things that we see that's somewhat controversial. Well, depending on who you ask, is the process of busing migrants. Obviously, it's been called by some of the more double-digit IQ'd part of the commentariat as human trafficking, which obviously doesn't meet legal muster. But it's also been, called by both conservatives and liberals as something that kind of, wallpapers over an issue. And I think that, a good honest look at the practice is simply, these border communities can't sustain this level of public support for this influx that they have. So, a cynical assessment could be that it's spreading the pain around at least. What's your take on that general policy?
Well, you're right. We can't do it all alone. We need help in South Texas. And it's time for New York and all these other countries, every other states like California, LA, to also be held accountable. They have been encouraging illegal immigration. So now help us in South Texas by taking care of these migrants. This isn't just a South Texas problem. And these migrants, by the way, agree to be bused to these cities. That was their destination. They wanted to go to these cities. They were not forced to go.
So it's almost like that, so long as there's no sweat equity coming from these sanctuary cities, the New Yorks, the Los Angeleses, the, San Franciscos, as long as there was no skin in the game, they were fine preening about the issue. But now that they actually have to be partners in addressing the problem, it seems like they're left a little wanting.
Correct. They need to see what we have been dealing for years. And I know that they have a homeless issue, in their own cities, but we also have our own problems as well that we deal with every day. And our border cities are hurting tremendously. They're using their resources, and we don't have a lot of resources because we are small cities already. Imagine if we have a certain situation where we need to have those funds for the people of South Texas, and because of this humanitarian crisis, we will no longer have those funds available. So it's so important for us to be prepared. We've had many storms, many flood issues in South Texas, and it's important that we are prepared just in case something like this ever happened. My home was flooded twice. That I was blessed to have insurance, but not everybody has flood insurance. So our cities, South Texas needs to be prepared for things like this whenever they happen. But because of this humanitarian crisis, we have been using our own funds to cover the cost of this crisis. And it shouldn't be a South Texas problem. This is a United States of America problem.
So to get to the nerdy part of what we all talk about in public policy, so then let's get to the solutions. And I know that you've written on this in a number of different ways, and you're out there advocating for policies both at the federal and then things that the state can do as well. Can you just take us through a couple things that if you could wave a magic wand and change and actually get a leader in the White House that was committed to this issue, what would you like to see changed in terms of either legislative reform or executive action?
Well, I believe that we have laws already in place, to be honest with you. We just need to enforce the laws. And we need a commander-in-chief that enforces the laws that we have in place already, that Congress put in place. And now Congress is criticizing our Border Patrol agents for enforcing the laws that they put in place. Prior to this administration, we had safe borders. Now, we'll never have a fully 100% secure border. Of course not. But we will not have this humanitarian crisis. We won't have the amount of fentanyl coming into our country. I believe that prior to this administration, we had policies that were working. The Remain in Mexico policy was working. And I believe that Mexico has a huge responsibility as well and should be held accountable as well. And no one really talks about that, but they should be securing their own borders. The Mexican people are not okay with this. I know that for a fact because my family lives in Tamaulipas, and they're not okay with this crisis. They see what's happening, and they're looking at themselves. What about us? What about our needs? They're taking care of them while they're waiting to cross into the United States, and they're feeding them for breakfast, for lunch, and dinner, while they see a child selling chicles for their breakfast, for their lunch and dinner. What about the homeless? What about the needs that Mexico has itself? So the people of Mexico do not support this humanitarian crisis.
I think you hit on a really, really important point. The couple of times that we've taken trips down there to meet with Border Patrol and to go and view the border, there is a tremendous amount of cross-border economic activity going on with people who live in Mexico coming over to work legally in the United States. There's all of that. With the crisis that's going on, they're having to crack down on that, so it's harder for people to get across the border.
Absolutely.
And so they're angry too because they've done it the right way. They've got, they've gotten the documentation so that they can work here and live in Mexico. But now, there's a huge wait, or there's a huge pause or delay for them to get over here. So they're frustrated as well, as I'm sure. So that's a really, really good point. Maybe there's some public pressure that we could could be created from that kind of thing to even push.
We need to put
the Mexican
pressure on
officials
Mexico.
to do
Absolutely.
as well. I want to get to a couple other issues while we have you here. This is fantastic. We could really go into the border and just talk all day, but there's so many different facets to it and so many things that you've weighed in on that we could get to. But how do you, I kind of want to get to 30,000 foot level again. You obviously spent time in Congress. You're looking now at a House that's now run by the Republicans. What's your take on kind of how the agenda is shaping up? Obviously, there was kind of a foot fault there at the beginning and kind of a pushback, and one of our favorite Congressman Chip Roy was involved in all of that. But now that we're past that, we have a speaker. They're trying to enact an agenda for the American people. What do you make of how all that's shaping up, and what Republicans are doing to show a different face, or show an alternative to how Washington could be run?
Well, the American people are watching, and they will hold the Republican Party accountable. If they ran on border security, they need to secure a border. They need to put in a policy that does just that. And I'm very proud of our speaker and the work that he's doing. But it's important that we put in place policies that will secure the border, but also impeach Mayorkas. We ran on that.
Amen.
So the American people is waiting, and we will hold all of them accountable, Republicans and Democrats. So it's so important that, that they get it done. We deserve it. We're going through a very difficult time, not just in South Texas, but throughout the country. And all we're asking is for them to make their promises true.
So the border obviously is a big issue. Derek, what other issues? I mean, inflation, energy, Republicans are in charge now. They, especially when you're in the House, you run the agenda. It's not like the Senate where you have to get consensus for everything to move forward, right? You can literally push your agenda. Border obviously is going to be a big one, particularly for Texas. What other issues do you think they should be pushing at the national level?
Well, I honestly think that, we need to have serious and sober discussions on, various elements of foreign policy. Now, we've been in this malaise, going all the way back to Iraq, where we've, we were operating under authorizations of use of military force. And once in a while, you'll see a libertarian type coming through and saying, this is not the constitutional order, or this is not how it's supposed to go. I think that with what's going on in Ukraine, a lot more people are taking a serious look at that, even though we are not, at least directly involved in kinetic activity. But I would be interested from your perspective, what do you think the opportunities, foreign policy specific, the opportunities for overlap might be, and to be honest with you, the opportunities for differentiation might be, because, I'd like to say, differentiation with this current administration, but I can't really tell what their foreign policy is.
Yeah, me either. I mean, look what's happening with China. Look what's happening with this balloon. So.
Okay, so now we're getting to the real issue. Should we shoot down the Chinese balloon or not? Myra Flores.
I say yes. If it would be here in Texas, it would have been done already.
They've got guns in Montana. No, but that's a really good point, especially because, that's part of what Biden ran on was getting, he had spent, 5 decades or whatever on the Foreign Relations Committee. He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. That
it might be more of an indictment of the institution than of the individual.
Right, exactly.
I mean, we're laughing about it, right? Yeah. It's funny, but at the same time, it's serious.
Mm-hmm.
It's serious that this is happening. Right. What are we going to do about it?
We used to be at a place, where we would all agree that, people would wear their red shirt or their blue shirt and they would act accordingly. But then, the saying that, political differences ended at the water's edge, those days are long gone, I would say.
And I think that, it weakens us as a country, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans. And I think that this division amongst us does weaken us. And that's, China, Russia's dream, for us to be divided. And Washington wants us to stop talking to each other. We need to come back and sit down at the table, have a respectful conversation, and focus on the things that we agree on. Because at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and I want to believe that we all want what's best for our country.
Yeah, and maybe ironically enough, it's usually when divided government, when we have to find those things, those commonalities, in order to get anything passed through the legislature to even get to the president's desk.
That's right.
All right, so one more issue before we get to our top topics. I want to get we probably sick of hearing about it, I'm sure, for our listeners on the show, but obviously parent empowerment and changing, more accountability within our school systems is going to be the number one issue. We now have the governor is out and has launched a statewide tour where he's going to be touting parent empowerment reforms and this idea that he keeps saying over and over again that parents should be in charge of their kids' education. Talk a little bit about that and the hopes and the opportunities for a place like Texas to finally have real parent empowerment and real school choice.
I'm really excited. I believe that no zip code should dictate our children's future, and by us giving parents that choice, it's going to improve the lives of many children, especially in areas where they don't have that level of education that they deserve to have. Public schools have worked for my children, I'll be honest, but that doesn't mean that it works for everyone. And I stand with those parents that it doesn't work. And I think that it's just the right thing to do. They're our children. We should have the control of our children's education. They're our children. We're supposed to be raising them with our values. And I see a lot of indoctrination in our schools. And we need to hold them accountable. And I think competition is good, not just for schools, for everyone. And I think it's going to make our public schools better, because we don't want to get rid of public schools. We want to make them better.
And, the debate right now seems to have devolved to, folks defending the proposals that'll actually get, children in the educational environment that will help them the best. But the other side seems to be really focusing on the institution and the sanctity of the institution. And I'm pro public education. I mean, I'm never been, never mixed words about that. But again, it's defending the institution for the institution's sake, not the outcomes, not making sure it's accessible, not making sure, to take their word, equitable. but just rather that the institution itself is left unassailed. That doesn't seem to be focusing on who's supposed to be benefiting from this public institution, and that being the children.
And this debate is going to rage. I think, it's only going to get more heated as both the right and the left are continuing to promote their particular positions on this. We'll see how the House and the Senate deal with it once we get past the state of the state and once the legislation gets submitted, and we're going to really have this huge debate all year. I want to hit a couple of top topics real quick. Just kind of rapid fire talk about this. We had the big ice storm, I guess, this week, and everybody kept their fingers crossed that the grid was going to hold up. And it did. The grid obviously, did hold up. There were some localized outages. I think in the city of Austin, of all places, can't figure out how to keep the lights on. But a lot of it was done. A lot of that was, at least everybody agrees that the outages were likely as a result of ice developing on power lines and those kinds of things. But overall, what I want to point out is thankfully for fossil fuels, the lights stayed on. And of course, the left has a very anti-fossil fuel agenda. And when you look at, when you need power the most, the renewables and those kinds of things just don't show up because the wind doesn't blow and because the wind turbines are frozen. What do you make of Myra, what do you make of the left's anti-energy, push on this? I mean, what would have happened if we were, trying to, if our grid depended on, say, 50% of it, depended on things like renewables? And obviously, we would have a major catastrophe. As you debate with folks on this energy issue, like, what do you make of this big push to get away from the reliable energy that keeps the lights on?
Well, I mean, look at California. I mean, they're a great example that it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Half the people in Texas would have been without electricity if we would follow their lead. I'm very proud of our governor and the improvements he's made, and it showed during this storm that we have improved and we've done better. And I look at California and I tell people, look at California. If you support that type of agenda, look at their situation. They're telling people not to connect their cars, electric cars.
Yeah. Everybody's got to buy electric cars, but then don't use them.
But don't use them, don't charge them. We don't have enough. So I'm very proud of the work that our governor has done, and it showed.
Is there going to be, Derek, do you think in the legislature, do you think there's going to be more push to subsidize more renewable energy or to get away from using fossil fuels?
I think there's going to be partly that, and I think there's also going to be a pivot, because I think they realize, when I say they, I mean people that, the people that spent the last couple of years rooting for the grid to fail. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see an actual pivot away to, well, the state is still responsible for hardening the infrastructure as it exists. So, we can debate about what the proper role of government is, but whether the, state government should go through and start burying lines in South Austin is not necessarily, I think, a debate for adults to be having. I do think that smart municipal management should be having these discussions, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But whether the state should be on the hook for, securing the right-of-ways, buried lines, or whatever the case might be, I think that's not an appropriate question to be asking state government.
So one other issue is kind of fun, I guess. I don't know, it's kind of an odd word for this, but it turns out, there was a big controversy the last couple of weeks about whether or not the Biden administration was going to try and institute a ban on gas stoves, right? There's this big issue that came out, and there was a couple of reports, I think, from the Wall Street Journal and others, and of course there was a major pushback, and then the media, of course, flipped then and said, there was never going to be a gas stove ban.
Republicans pounce.
Republicans are pouncing. Conservatives are, making a big deal out of this.
Conservative backlash.
Well, of course, Fox News did their due diligence, and of course they found the memos, they found the receipts. In a memo dated last October, Richard Trumka, who President Biden appointed to serve on this Product Safety Commission, wrote to a fellow commissioner that there was sufficient evidence for the agency to move forward with a notice of proposed rulemaking to ban gas stoves in the near future. Mm-hmm. And so here's this commission that the president has asked them to look at ways to save the environment and so on and so forth. And of course, here's one of the officials writing to another one saying we absolutely need to ban gas stoves. So, comment on the gas stove ban if you want to, but also just this, again, this goes back to the trust in government, and right. They've got the documents. I mean, they know that these memos are out there, and yet they walk right out on stage and lie about it. What do you make of all that?
I mean, it's just nonsense. I mean, Washington has lost common sense. Everyone has gas stoves. I mean, it doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. You know, Democrats have gas stoves, Republicans, like Americans. And
Democrats for gas stoves.
yeah, exactly. This makes no sense, but I'm glad that they felt the backlash. And this is a result when we actually come together on something we agree on. And the American people said, hey, I'm a Democrat, but you're crazy. You're not taking away my gas stove. So this is a great example of us coming together on something we agree on.
I'd yes and that by saying, well, how are we supposed to boil the water as we had to in the city of Austin if we have electric stoves and the power's out?
Yeah, no, really good point. And, you know, and I feel some sympathy to the president's press secretary who has to walk out there knowing, you know, the fresh attacks that they're going to get from the press, knowing that this documentation's out
Does
there.
she actually answer anything?
No, she's going to circle back and do all of that.
Yeah, I mean, shouldn't have appointed a Trumpka then, who that apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Yeah.
Guy knows about as much about administrative law as his dad know about running a profitable business.
All right, so we're gonna jump to our final segment of the show. I want to get into this because this is a controversial and provocative issue for a number of reasons. We all know social media is ubiquitous. I mean, everybody's on social media. We just did a poll asking about people's media habits, and I think something like 60 to 70% of all Texans use social media at least once a day. A lot of percentage of that, 30 or 40%, use it multiple times a day. So social media is all around us. I think it's now number 2 in terms of how Texans get their news. Number 1 is local TV, but number 2 is social media. They say that's how they get a lot of their news. But there are a lot of problems with social media, particularly the influence that it has on minors. TPPF has published some research into this, and unfortunately, it's a bit of a parade of horribles in terms of kids getting peer pressured on social media to take these incredible risks. Some kids are dying, some kids are hurting themselves, doing these TikTok challenges and so on and so forth. I'd invite you to read that research that we have out there. But one Texas state rep, Jared Patterson, has bill number 896, which would a child between the ages of 13 and 18 would not be allowed to use a social media platform. The bill said social media platforms would require users to have an account in order to utilize that platform, and that the platform would verify that the account is being held by a person of at least 18 years of age. So this is in effect a way to prohibit minors from using social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and so forth. A lot of conservatives have a lot of libertarian sensibilities. Yeah. It may not necessarily sit right. You can make the comparison to cigarettes or alcohol or driving, and there's a lot of restrictions for minors. Does this fall into that category for you, Myra, or what's your take on essentially a ban for social media for minors?
Well, personally, my children don't have social media. My son is already going to be 18 years old. But that's a decision I made as a parent. So I do think that, we should respect parents and they know what's best for their children. But I do agree that, no child should be having social media. They should be living their best life, focusing on school, playing outside. But at the same time, I don't want to cross that line and be telling parents what's best for their children. I don't think that the government should be telling parents what to do. It's all about parents' choice, right?
Mm-hmm. Does it help parents though to help them, know? I mean, again, I would think from the comms perspective, it helps send the message that this isn't something that's for minors. I mean, yes, of course, we have kids under 21 who access alcohol. We have kids under 18 who can find a way to get cigarettes and so on. But at least from a community perspective, the fact that there's a law against this at least helps parents make the case to their kids that this is something that's not for you. Do you still think that, that crosses the line into limiting what a parent can and can't do, or at least their choices that they make, or they're limiting their ability to be a good parent? Does it still cross that line for you?
Well, I think it's important that parents are informed how damaging social media can be for their child, so they can make that decision. Ultimately, there's just so much garbage on social media, and there's so much bullying on social media. But some adults shouldn't even have social media.
Should ban it for adults.
They should ban it for adults, I see so much hate, so much division on social media that hurts us all. And I don't think a child should be able to have that platform, especially if they're going through difficult times, you know, or mental issues, and then they're on social media getting all this hate from adults a lot of times. So absolutely, I think that it's important that parents are informed how hurtful this can be for their children's mental health as well.
Absolutely.
But like I said, I'm a little hesitant, you know, when it comes to government telling parents what to do and what's best for their child.
So Derek, you know, the sexy debate on this one is what we've been talking about here, which is should government be able to do this? One question I have is, can government do this? I mean, from a legal perspective or even just a logistical perspective, you know, what have we looked at TPPF and other organizations? You know, how would we even go about doing this, and is it even something that would be possible?
Yeah, and I mean, the short answer, yes, we can definitely restrict or set the guidelines for access to such products in our state, specifically when it comes to, you know, special populations being minors. And you know, I kind of find myself, I definitely agree with everything I just heard, but I also kind of agree with the push in general, because you remember we had this, you know, at the beginning of the social media revolution, you know, back when you were watching Star Search. But back in those days, you know, it was like, this is going to bring the world together. We're going to have this utopian vision of human interaction. What it turned out to be is just this magnification of the worst parts of humanity. We're going to have, you know, Patriot 1776 and Never Trump 420 just sitting here arguing back and forth. And, you know, this, you know, behind the veil of secrecy. And it just, it's not productive to discourse, not productive to discussion. Now, there's obviously been a whole lot made about, you know, Russian interference or things like that on social media, which obviously turned out to be a bit of a hoax unto itself. But the thing is, it's like, if we're talking about something that's supposed to, you know, come alongside and lift up, you know, society and the discourse and everything, we're just not getting that from social media. Now, is this the solution, or is the solution as written a way to go? Well, that's for the legislature to decide. You know, this is why we send representatives to Austin, so that they can have these tough debates. And let's be honest, this one is a tough debate, because you mentioned the libertarian sympathies that many members of the Republican caucus even have on this. But I think that at the very least, it is a debate absolutely worth having.
So I'll break a little bit of news. TPPF was just in the field with a new poll. We got our results back yesterday. We asked this question about the social media ban for minors, and we got a very surprising result. 88% of Texans support the social media ban for minors. One of the more interesting things, if you really dig down into, we divided it by generation, so by age. Over 90% of millennials, over 90% of Gen Z support social media ban for minors. These are the folks who are, you know, who grew up with social media their entire life. It's not a new thing to them, like most of us. They grew up with it. They use it the most, more than anybody else does, and yet they're supportive of this ban for social media for minors. What do you take away from that? I mean, you have you know, kids at that you know, right about to be that age.
Yeah.
You know, does that make sense? Does that trigger something? You're like, yeah, they hate it, or you know, they're you know, they don't want to be addicted to it either, or what?
Yeah.
Like, what do you make of that?
Well, you know, my children are not on social media, right? And they probably honestly wouldn't care about social media. I keep them very busy, but that's awesome to hear. And I think that we do need to hear, you know, Texans, and if that's what they think it's best, then I agree. Let's do it. If the majority agree. You know, I had no idea about this poll. I think it's amazing.
It's totally took us by surprise.
Yeah, that's great to hear. That's great to hear, because we do want to do what the American people want. At the end of the day, the people that are serving at the local and the state level are to serve Texans, and if that's what Texans want, then we should be able to do it.
Interestingly, the lowest level of support, and it was still like, you know, 85%, but the lowest level of support came from 35 to 45, ages 35 to 45, which we sort of figure, you know, that level of parents, they're communicating with their kids on social media as well, or they're following their kids' activities in school or whatever through social media. So maybe that's why they would oppose it.
And I think parents are starting to see how addicting social media can be. They're realizing that it's hurting their children. You know, I've seen a lot of videos where they take away the phone from their child, and their child becomes angry
Yeah.
and wants to hurt the parent because their phone was taken away or their PlayStation was taken away. And that's when they realize, okay, this has gone out of hand. So I think parents on both sides are realizing that it's hurting our children. And I'm glad to hear that most Texans support getting rid of social media for minors.
Derek, with that news, I mean, with that new information that, obviously TPPF and others are going to be putting out there, do you think that changes anything about what's going to happen in the legislature? And maybe, Representative Patterson's bill is not so controversial anymore.
Yeah, do I think that the information is going to change things? Largely, no. Not because I think that it's not useful information, but I think that it's, much as we've discussed here, it's a place that people already, from whatever their station is in life or their life situation is, already recognize, some of the pitfalls with it. And again, does that mean this particular bill is going to be the end all be all? Very, very rarely does a bill make it all the way from filing to getting the governor's signature without any sort of tweak here and there. But at the very least, I think the fact, and Representative Patterson needs to be praised for this, is he, with finger on the pulse, realized like this is a serious issue. And the funny thing is, it's we say like, oh well, this must be some sort of right wing crusade, and the very same comments that we've heard were actually made by Representative Mary Gonzalez, who's a Democrat from El Paso, and so she rightly identifies some of the pitfalls that we have in this area as well. And so I'm really looking forward to the debate. I do think that there's going to be some interesting lobby action on this because, obviously there are dollars and cents at play. But again, the fact that this is the opening salvo, I think should give us all, it should hearten us all that the debate's going to be had in good faith and publicly.
Well, very well said. I think, Myra, it's so awesome having you here. It's so awesome to have you here as our very first guest. We're very excited about that. I would want to do a whole show just on parenting advice from Myra Flores because you've got 3 kids that are not on social media. 4 kids that are not on social media?
I have 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. And yeah, my oldest is going to be 18 years old. And
you're keeping them busy and they're involved in sports and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. We'll do a whole show on parenting advice with Myra Flores.
We'll love it.
A whole new one. So as always, thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate our listeners and our viewers out there. Until next time, as we always like to close with Sam Houston's quote, do good and suffer the consequences. We'll see you next time.